practiced since 2012.
Have you been working in juvenile court?
I have.
What sort of work are you most commonly doing in juvenile court?
I would say that my work is split 50-50. I handle juvenile delinquency cases, which are children that are charged with what would be criminal offenses if they were adults. And I work in dependency cases, which involve child custody. I handle cases both as the guardian ad litem for children, the advocating attorney for children, and I also represent parents.
Throughout your career as an attorney, have you dealt with the admissibility and the obtaining of children's statements and the proper procedures to do so?
I have frequently.
Okay. And when you were involved in this case, when you were speaking with any children, any of the Wimbush children, did you employ methods designed to prevent you from leading a child, but rather getting the truth from the child without any preconceived ideas from you?
I did.
How do you go about doing that?
The way that I handle these issues is I first begin building a rapport with the child. I ask them their name and their age, and if they can tell me their birth date, depending on their age, whether I'll ask them how to spell their name. And I generally introduce myself as, I'm your attorney. Did you even know you needed an attorney, to sort of develop a rapport so they're comfortable speaking with me. And then I try to begin asking them general questions, and based on their answers to my general questions, I will follow up with them. But I try not to suggest a particular subject. I try to let them lead me to the subject. And as they disclose more to me, I will ask questions more about their disclosures. And that is how I managed my interviews with all of the Wimbush children in this case.
Okay, throughout the time of all of your contacts with the children?
Yes, I really only spoke with each of them one time about the circumstances of their household and any potential abuse, because it is also not good to question them repeatedly. So once I had sort of determined the circumstances, or what they could tell me about the circumstances of their family and their household, I moved away from those subjects. And so now I'll ask them about school and things like that, and I may employ leading questions now that I know them, but it has nothing to do with any outcries of abuse. Anytime we're dealing with potential outcries of abuse, I always employ what I call forensic interviewing techniques.
And forensic interviewing techniques are, as you described, for one particular purpose. What is that purpose?
That purpose is to elicit a true and accurate outcry of abuse, if any, from the child without being suggestive to them and without leading them to make an outcry that may not be truthful.
What was the very first date that you met Isaiah Winbush and Ricardo Winbush? Well, let's start with Ricardo Winbush.
I met Ricardo Winbush for the first time on June 19th, 2014. And I met Isaiah Winbush on June 26th, 2014.
For Ricardo Winbush, when you first met him, were you aware of the details of the allegations?
Not initially, no. When I first met with him and began to build a rapport with him, I did not know the nature of the allegations. Based on his affect during my initial conversations with him, I did step out and seek to obtain documentation as to why he was in juvenile court, and I became aware of some limited details, and then I further questioned him, and essentially my questioning started with, well, where do you live? What kind of house do you have? And as he would tell me more about his home, I could follow up with questions about sleeping arrangements and things like that.
Okay. And so are those proper forensic interview techniques for a child?
They are.
Okay. Did you do anything in your questioning to lead him to a conclusion or to lead him to stating certain facts that he did not originate?
No, I did not.
Okay. And in fact, were many of Ricardo's statements to you later confirmed by other sources as being accurate?
Yes, and in fact, during my conversation with him on June 19th of 2014, I stepped out several times to attempt to verify anything that I could. And the information I could verify appeared to be accurate coming from him.
eventually were statements made by the defendants that in fact confirmed or reestablished what Ricardo initially told you?
Significantly, yes. A lot of time their time frames would be different, but the substance of the statements were confirmed by Mr. and Mrs. Wimbush when they testified in a hearing.
And has Ricardo's statements been consistent over time?
I haven't questioned him multiple times, but I have been subject to reading reports, and the statements he made regarding, I haven't questioned him multiple times regarding these allegations, but the statements he made to me have been significantly consistent with the other reports that I've received in the case.
Okay. And what about statements made by Isaiah? When you spoke with him initially, can you describe those circumstances very briefly, please?
Sure. I met with him at a private home, and I employed forensic interviewing techniques with him. His statements I have not questioned him multiple times, but his statements have remained consistent from the reports that I have seen. He was actually very forthcoming with me in my conversations with him.
And have Isaiah's statements that you obtained from him in the forensic interview been corroborated by the defendants themselves?
They have been corroborated by the defendants, and they were also corroborated by other sources that I was able to obtain during my investigation.
That's all I have on this issue, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Wimbush, any questions as to indicia of reliability of this witness? I'm sorry?
No, I have no questions.
All right, Ms. Wimbush, any questions of this witness as to indicia of reliability?
No, I don't. Thank you.
All right, then the court, not having any objection and no questioning by the defendants, will find that her testimony is deemed reliable for purposes of trial. And is she your next witness?
She is, Your Honor.
All right, so that is the 15-minute time recess for the jurors. Can we just proceed? Does anyone need a short recess?
No, Your Honor.
All right, then let's go ahead and get the jury in, and then I'll let Mr. Mayfield call Ms. Chansey.
We have a protective order issue on my file.
Okay, yes, one more issue, I'm sorry. And who is raising that issue on your behalf?
I will be the circumstances of their clients. It can be children, it can be adults that are incapacitated in some way, or mentally ill and can't care for their own needs. But in juvenile court, you are tasked with investigating the circumstances of a child or children and their family, and you make recommendations to the court as what would be in the best interest of those children regarding whatever the case, whatever arises in their case.
So does part of your job then include investigating the circumstances of the person whose protection you're tasked to cover?
Absolutely.
Let me call your attention to June 19th, 2014. Did you have an opportunity to meet anyone from the Wimbush family?
I did. On June 19th of 2014, initially I met Ricardo Wimbush Jr. That evening or afternoon, I also was not formally introduced to his parents, but I came into, I guess, the acquaintance of Mr. and Mrs. Wimbush that are seated in the courtroom today.
Describe for the jury the layout there in juvenile court that facilitates your ability to communicate with the children in serious issues such as this.
Sure. They've undergone a significant renovation since 2014, but in 2014, the third floor of the courthouse annex, which is located just around the corner from this building, is devoted to juvenile court. And on that third floor, there was what was called the kids' room. It's a large room that children can be put in or sit in while they're waiting for court hearings and things like that. There's generally an adult from either the Department of Family and Children's Services or a juvenile court employee that supervises the children in the room. That room had like murals painted on the walls. It had smaller furniture. It had some books and some games. I believe there's also a television in there. If you bring a movie, you can watch it, but I don't know if they leave movies there all the time. But it was just intended to be a place that you could gain some privacy, the children could gain some privacy and have something to do. And it gives the children's attorneys an opportunity to speak with them without the influence of anyone else being present.
So that would be you, the children's attorney?
That's correct.
Okay. And is this the room where you met Ricardo?
It is. I met with him in the children's room on June 19th of 2014.
If you would please, describe to the jury that initial contact and what happened in that meeting with him.
Sure. When I first met with him, I had no information about the case. I just knew that he was at juvenile court for some purpose. Initially, when I meet with children clients, my first interaction with them is just to try to build a rapport with them. I'm a strange adult that they may have never met before or have only met before previously in relation to court proceedings. So I came in to speak with Ricardo, and I introduced myself, and sort of the way that I start speaking with children is I'm like, I bet you didn't even know you needed an attorney. You didn't know you needed a lawyer. And so I kind of started that conversation with him, and I asked him his name and how old he was. He had a very, very flat affect. He exhibited virtually no emotion. It was very difficult to build a rapport with him. And he spoke so softly that I had to get very close to him to even be able to hear him sometimes within inches of his face. So once I spoke with him briefly, I stepped out and obtained some paperwork so that I could try to get a little information about why we were even at court that day. And then I stepped back in and continued speaking with him.
Okay. When you're talking with a child, particularly on a legal matter, and you're conducting an investigation to find out information from the child, are there any special techniques that a person in your profession employs to ensure that the information from the child is accurate and not suggested by you, the interviewer?
Absolutely. Most attorneys refer to it as forensic interviewing techniques, and a lot of times law enforcement will refer to these techniques as forensic interviewing techniques. Your goal is to have an open and honest dialogue with the child, but you attempt not to ask leading questions, and you attempt to allow them to introduce subjects, and then you follow up with the subjects that they introduce into your conversation. Because the goal is to get a truthful dialogue with the child, and because children can be more suggestive with adults than adults, you take special care not to suggest answers to them, but to have a dialogue in which they sort of direct the dialogue.
Did you use forensic interview techniques when you were speaking with Ricardo?
I did.
All right. Well, so you said you had an initial conversation with him. You obtained a little bit of information and returned back to the room.
Yes.
Tell us what happened in your conversation with Ricardo Jr. next.
Sure. My conversation next, at that point I knew that DFACS had requested the family come in, and I knew the general circumstances was regarding his living situation at the home, and that he had allegedly been separated from his family, and that he had been locked in a room. And so I came back in and I began having a discussion with him about his family, and to open that avenue up, I had previously asked him about his name and his age, and I asked him where he lived, and he told me he lived in Beaufort, and I don't believe I specifically asked him his address, but I followed up with, well, what kind of home do you live in? Is it an apartment? Is it a house by itself? Is it connected to other people's houses? Because again, not wanting to be suggestive, and he began telling me about his home. It was a single family home. I asked him how many bedrooms his house had, and he didn't really understand that question. He mentioned something called, there's the sleeping room, and since he had suggested the sleeping room, I asked him, well, what's that? And he informed me that that is where the children slept. And I asked him to describe the room for me, and his description was that it was a room essentially full of mattresses, and I asked him if there was a bathroom attached to it, and he said that there was. And I asked him if that was where he slept, but he told me that he had previously slept there. He had not slept there in quite some time, though.
Okay.
I then asked him to describe the other rooms in his house. There was a room where his parents slept, and he said that when he came to the basement, to live in the basement, he believed his youngest sister had been sleeping in the room with his parents. He was unsure if she had moved to the sleeping room because he hadn't seen her in quite some time. He told me about a room with where they could play a lot of Legos. There was a room that he described that sounded like an arts and crafts room. There was a room, he described, I think, 4 bathrooms on the upper levels of the home. He described a bathroom in the basement. And so, based on his description, it sounded like somewhere in the range of a 5-bedroom home, and they utilized a lot of the rooms for the kids' activities. And so, once he had brought up, had sort of described his home to me, I said, well, where do you sleep? Who do you sleep with? And he informed me that he slept in the basement. And I asked him about his room in the basement. He told me that he had a bed, and I asked him about his bed, and he informed me that it was on the ground. I questioned him further, and he informed me that it had a box spring, and it was a mattress on a box spring on the ground. And I asked him if he had sheets on his bed, and he told me that he did not. I asked him to tell me more about his room, and he asked me, well, what do you want to know? And I said, well, does it have a bathroom attached to it? And he told me that it did not have an attached bathroom. I asked him if it had any windows. He informed me that it did have a window, but the window was covered. I was unclear in what manner the window was covered, but he could not see out the window. So I said, well, how do you know if it's day or night? And he explained to me that there were shadows. He could sort of tell shadows, and he informed me that his mother would come down and see him during the day, so he knew that generally when she saw him, it was daytime. And I asked him, I said, well, how often do you see your mom? And he told me that he generally sees her twice a day. Sometimes he would see her a third time a day. And I asked him, well, how often do you see the other family members? And he informed me that he did not see his dad every day. He could not really articulate on what schedule he saw his father, but he did not see his father on a daily basis. And he informed me that he hadn't seen his siblings in a very long time. And so once he told me that, I began asking him about, well, when is the last time you can remember seeing your siblings? And he told me that it was a very long time ago. And I asked him, well, is there anything that you can remember, like an event that you can remember that you can associate? I didn't use the word associate, but essentially I was trying to determine if there was an event that he could associate with the last time he saw his siblings. And at that point, he told me that he had run away from home previously. He told me that he thought that everyone had left the home. He had been listening, and he thought no one was home, and that he had gone upstairs in the home, and that he had moved down to the basement at that point, but he was allowed to leave his room in the basement at that point. And he thought everyone was gone, and so he went upstairs, and his father was home, and he told me that his father beat him and put him back in the basement. And in my line of work, you get a lot of different language for how families punish their children, so I wanted to determine what he meant by the word beat me. And so I asked him to describe, well, when you say that your father beat you, what do you mean? And he told me that he beat him with his fists and told him to go back to the basement, and that Ricardo Jr. had then run away. And I said, I asked him, well, what happened when you ran away? And he informed me that he had been located by the police and returned home. So at that point, that was something that I could potentially verify from what he was telling me. And so I stepped out of the room, and anytime the police bring any sort of charges against someone under the age of 17, unless it's a very significant case that gets handled in these courts, it goes to the juvenile court. So they're called juvenile delinquency matters or unruly children matters, depending on the situation. So I stepped down to the clerk of juvenile court, and I asked them if the family had any history with the juvenile court. And they searched by his name and his date of birth, and he did have a prior referral to juvenile court for giving a false name to law enforcement. And whenever a case is brought in juvenile court, there's documentation filed by the police with generally a small synopsis of what happened. So it's called a complaint. And so they pulled the complaint for me, and I reviewed the complaint, and there was in fact a complaint in juvenile court. It arose from an incident that occurred on August 22nd of 2012. And so I was able to verify that he had in fact had a case that was referred to juvenile court. I also saw on the complaint that the case had not actually gone in front of a judge. They had done what's called an informal adjustment, which is sort of a counseling session with a child and sometimes with his family. And so I stepped back in, and I began to follow up on the time that he ran away. And I asked him, well, what happened after that? And he said that is when his parents placed the lock on his door. And I followed up, well, is that a lock that you could open? Or tell me about the lock. And he told me that it was outside of his door, on the outside of his door, and he described to me that it was sort of up high on the door. He used his hand, that it was more like eye level rather than doorknob level. And he informed me that that's when he had been locked in the room, was when he was returned by the police. And he informed me that the last time he had left the home was when he came to juvenile court for that informal adjustment. So based on the report that I had obtained and what he told me, I came to believe that he had been locked in the room since that date on August 22nd of 2012. And he told me that besides leaving to come to juvenile court, he hadn't been let out of the room in that time period. And so I followed up with him to try to verify. I followed up with him, and at the time there were 3 male judges in the juvenile court of Gwinnett County, and I knew that he had not seen a judge because I had pulled that report. But I said, well, did you see the super old man judge that keeps his glasses on his nose and kind of looks at you over your glasses? Or did you see the judge that always wears the bow tie? Or did you see the third judge who talks sort of softly and is very sort of soft-spoken? And he said, he told me that he didn't believe that he had seen any of those people, that he saw someone in a smaller room, such as what he described sounded like an office, which was verified by the report that there had been an informal adjustment in the case rather than him going in front of the judge. And so I asked him, well, after the lock went on the door, when is the last time you saw your siblings? And he told me that it was at the point that the lock went on the door, which I had come to believe was August 22nd of 2012, so just shy of 2 years. And then I began asking him more about his room. I said, well, is there a bathroom attached to your room? And I had already asked him that, but I asked him again, and he said, no, there's not. And I said, well, what do you do if you have to use the bathroom? And he told me that when his mom would come down or his dad would come down, they bring him food and that they would allow him to go to the restroom. And that we had already established was 2, maybe 3 times a day. And so I asked him, well, what do you do if you got to go to the bathroom when they're not there with you? And he told me that there was a plastic jar in his room that he could use if he needed to go to the bathroom, and that his mom would clean it out periodically for him. And then I asked him, well, what about food? And he informed me that his mom brought him food, or his dad, when he saw his dad. And I asked him, well, what do you eat when they bring you? And when they bring you food, and he described oatmeal, rice, and he described that on a really good day he would get sandwiches, and that he mostly only ate twice a day. On occasion, it would be 3 times a day. When I met with him, he was very, very thin, to the point that I thought he might be malnourished. When I met with him, you could also see that he appeared to be dirty. And so I said, well, when your mom and dad let you out of the room, what do you do? And he didn't really understand that question. And I said, well, they let you go to the bathroom. We've already talked about that. What are the other things that you do? And he told me that occasionally he would brush his teeth. And I asked him if that was every day, and he told me that it was not. And then I asked him, and I can't recall if I specifically asked him about baths or showers, but I asked him how he bathed. And he informed me that he could not remember the last time he bathed, but he believed it was before the lock was placed on his door. And during this whole time, he spoke very softly. He exhibited no emotion. A lot of times he wouldn't make any eye contact with me. And he sort of sat with his shoulders sort of slumped. He was very respectful, but he sat with his shoulders sort of slumped, and he was very soft-spoken. And I noticed that he had, that his fingernails appeared to be very unkempt. They were a little bit long and they were jagged. But I didn't want, at that point, I didn't want to specifically bring that up to him, because I didn't want him to feel any sort of embarrassment or like I was making fun of him. So I continued questioning him about his room. Based on what he said, his room sounded like it was dark a lot. I asked him, well, what do you do when you're alone in the basement? And I did say, do you have any books or toys or games? And he told me that he did not. He told me that before the lock went on his door, he had snuck upstairs and brought a book down, and maybe a portable DVD player is what I believe he was describing. And he had gotten in trouble for essentially lying about those things or stealing those things, and they had been taken away from him. He told me that he did not have any books or implements to occupy his time while he was in the basement. So I said, well, what do you do, man? Tell me how you spend your days. And he volunteered at that point that he would pick at the paint on the walls of his room, but that he got in trouble for that, and that earned him more time in the basement. And I asked him if he expected to get out of the basement, and he said he thought he might get out sometime around October of that year, 2014. And so at that point I said, so is that why your nails are sort of jagged? Is that from picking at the walls? And he told me that it was. He told me that he could hear some of the things his family was doing, so he would listen to what they were doing. And he told me that he missed his siblings.
Did you have any conversation with him about his ability on his own to get out of the room?
I did. I asked him about, when we discussed the lock, I asked him if he could open the lock, and he informed me that he could not. I asked him if he tried, and he told me that he had not.
Did he tell you why he never even tried?
He did not.
Did you talk with him anything at all about calling for help, or yelling for help, or yelling out to other siblings?
I did not specifically ask him those questions. He did tell me he believed his siblings knew that he was in the basement, because he had been, prior to his door being locked, he had been staying in the basement but had had some access to his siblings. According to him, his siblings knew that he was there. According to him, his family did not have many visitors, and I did specifically ask whether he had told any family members about where he was living, and he told me that once the lock was placed on his door, he had not seen any of his family members except for his mother and his father.
Would that include aunts, uncles, grandparents?
Correct.
Okay.
He specifically mentioned a maternal aunt, Tia, and his maternal grandmother. He had not seen them in quite some time, but those were the two family members, besides his siblings and his mother and father, that he told me that he was familiar with. That they had, at some point in the family, had a relationship with them.
Did Ricardo talk about conversations he had with his mom and or dad about his behavior when he was in the basement, in the room?
He did not, no. He told me that his mother, earlier on, his mother would spend more time with him in the basement when she brought him food and allowed him to go to the restroom, and that they would talk. We did not go into the content of those conversations, but he said more recently her visits had been shorter, and he did not spend nearly as much time with his mother. And as I said before, he did not see his father on a daily basis. He couldn't really articulate how often it was that he saw his father.
Did you talk with him about his beliefs on why he was in the locked in that room, and well, I guess just that, why he was there?
I did. I asked him that question. I was like, well, why did you end up in the basement? And beyond the lock going on the door, which he had associated with the August 22nd, 2012 incident, he initially came to the basement. He told me that he had inappropriately touched 3 of his siblings, and his mother told him that his mother had made the decision to keep him away from his siblings as a result of that. I questioned him about whether he had in fact done that, and what he remembered about that. He did not appear to have any recollection of ever having done anything like that, but it was something that he was told that he had done.
And when he was told that he had done it, was he told that he did it in a particular time period, how long it had been since he had done that?
He was not able to articulate that to me. I could not narrow it down, but he was a cognizant young man. He's intelligent and having conversation with me, and he did not remember having done it. So I came to believe if it happened at all, it would have been a significant time period in the past.
Okay. And was his explanation for being in the basement, as he saw it, more from disobedience, like taking the DVD player and the book and running away, or related to some other event that happened earlier, such as the touching?
I believe he believed he initially was moved to the basement as a result of those prior events, but he came to believe that the reason he was staying in the basement was because he did bad things, that he had taken the book and the DVD player and he lied. So he came to believe that it was punishment for those types of behaviors.
Okay. Have you continued to be his guardian ad litem throughout this time period?
Yes.
have you had many opportunities to speak with him?
Yes.
On some of those occasions, have you had conversations with him about where whether or not he would want to go back into the basement?
I have. As part of my duties as a guardian ad litem, I want to know what my clients want to see happen, and if it's within my professional and ethical constraints, I try to do for them what they want if it's appropriate. Ricardo Wimbush Jr. absolutely wants to go back home to his parents. And sometimes when you speak with him, he would even be willing to go back to the basement and back to being locked in the basement to obtain that outcome. And sometimes he says that he would, if it meant he had to go back to being locked in the basement, he would rather not go home. So he has, he loves his parents and his family and his siblings, and he has expressed both of those opinions. He would be willing to go back to being locked in the basement, and then at times he would not be willing to do so.
And as far as the family not being together now, to whom did he assign blame for that?
Himself.
And what did he do wrong what can he point to cause that disruption in the family?
He can't point to any one thing. He just he's written letters, and he has expressed to me verbally on several occasions that this is all his fault. If it hadn't been for what happened regarding him in juvenile court, that none of this would have happened, and that his parents would not be in the situation that they're in. Most recently, he has made progress in that regard. And he has expressed that he understands that this is not his fault, but for the vast majority of the time that I've known him, he has believed that this is all his fault.
You mentioned a letter. What letter was written by whom?
Ricardo Winbush Jr.
To whom?
It was to his parents. I don't recall if it was addressed to his mother or his father, but it was a letter that I explained to him that if he would like to write a letter to communicate with his parents, that he could, and that I or someone else related to the case would make sure that his parents received it. And so he did. I believe he's written a couple of letters, and one to his, and upon recollection, I believe that particular letter where he expresses that this is all my fault was addressed to his mother.
Okay. Do you recall what the note said?
It was a very short note. I believe it said it was an apology. I don't recall the specific language.
Okay. Did you have contact with Isaiah Winbush?
I did.
Are you a guardian ad litem for Isaiah as well?
I am.
What about the other 8 children?
I'm the guardian ad litem for all of the Wimbush children. There are 10 in total.
Okay. So when did you first meet Isaiah?
I met Isaiah on June 26, 2014.
Under what circumstances?
He was with a foster care placement, and I met him at the foster home that he was living at that time.
Okay. When you first met him, were you aware of his medical condition?
I had been made aware that he had some form of a mass on his stomach. At that point, I do not believe that the Department of Family and Children's Services had a physical done on him, but I had also received a photograph of his abdomen.
Okay. And did you have conversations with Isaiah regarding his medical care when he lived in the Wimbush home?
I did.
Will you describe that to the jury, please?
Sure. I employed the similar forensic interviewing techniques that were age appropriate for Isaiah. Isaiah was only, I believe, if I may refresh my recollection, Isaiah was 8 years old at the time that I first met him. We conversed. I built a rapport with him. He was very excited that he needed an attorney. He didn't really understand why he had a lawyer, but he thought it was pretty cool. that he had a lawyer. He was very easy to build a rapport with, and he was very talkative, which makes your job easier when the children are talkative and they'll volunteer information. He's a lovely child. And I began asking him questions about his home and his family. And I asked him if he remembered when he went to the doctor last, and he could not recall having gone to a doctor.
Did he talk with you concerning any communication he had with his parents about the site on his stomach? Were his parents aware of it?
They were. During my conversation with him, I asked him if he would mind showing me his tummy, because I knew that the issue was related to his abdomen area. He pulled up his shirt, and looking at him, it was on my right side, but it was on the left side of his abdomen. Can I stand up?
Certainly.
Okay. So he showed me his abdomen, and just above the waistline, there was what I believe to be a keloid scar, which is, in my experience working with children, is prominent in African American and Asian children, and it's essentially where they've had maybe a minor injury and there's just excess scar tissue. And then next to what I thought was a keloid scar, which I believe that was later confirmed as a scar, was a mass that was in between the scar and in between his belly button that was about the size of my fist. I asked him if I could touch his abdomen to feel it. It was a little bit squishy, but you could feel like fibrous strands and what felt like lumps in that mass. And so I asked him whether his family, specifically said, well, did your parents know that you had this on your stomach? And he said that they did. And in fact, his parents and all of his siblings knew. And I said, well, have you talked? I asked him if he'd ever talked with his parents about it. And he told me that he had told them that it itched. And I was like, what do you mean it itches? And he told me that his abdomen would itch a lot, and that his parents were aware of it, and that they were aware of the bump. He called it a bump on his stomach. I did not ascertain how long they had known about it, but he was very clear that both his parents and his siblings were aware that the mass was there.
Did he ever indicate to you how long it had been there or how it had changed over time?
He told me that it had been there for as long as he could remember, that it had gotten larger, but it had been the size that I viewed it at for quite some time. He did not articulate a specific number of weeks or months or dates, but he said for as long as he could remember, the mass had been there, and that it had itched, and that it had at one point been smaller, but it had been that size for a long time.
Okay. That's all the questions I have at this time, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Mr. Wimbush, first to you. Any questions for Ms. Chansey?
How you doing, Ms. Chancellor?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. One question on the informal adjustment that you received.
Yes, sir.
Did it show what the plan was for him, the thing that he was supposed to do after that?
No, sir. I pulled what we call the face sheet, which is just the history of when his name and his birth date and when the complaint was made and what the charges were. And then I pulled the actual, and it showed the disposition, and it said informal adjustment.
Okay.
And then I pulled the complaint document, which is the document that outlines the facts and circumstances of why the child is being brought into court. But I did not pull the entire file, so I have not done so I do not know what the follow-up regarding the informal adjustment was.
You stated that all the children slept in one room, and all 9 beds in one room.
All the children except
Yes.
for Ricardo.
And
I believe that at some point, Patience, your youngest child, had slept in the room with you and Mrs. Wimbush, but I never became clear as to when she made the transition over to the sleeping room.
Sure. Have you reviewed the video, the DVD that Ricardo had with Miss Churchill, Detective Churchill?
I have. I reviewed it one time, probably in, I wouldn't want to guess about the date. It's been well over a year and a half since I
Okay.
reviewed that video.
And how did Ricardo sound during that interview?
He sounded, he was a little more verbal than initially in that interview than he was initially in my conversation with him. And it appeared that he spoke a little bit more loudly, but I don't know if that's because of the acoustics of the room not being present. But you could certainly hear him in that video.
Okay. As far as education, what did he say about that?
He told me that he had, well, he described to me that his mom taught him, but I followed up with him regarding whether if he had specific books or anything like that he was working out of. He informed me that his mom had stopped teaching him once the lock was placed on the bedroom door. And so, in my opinion, based on my investigation, I believe that had been since August 22nd of 2012 or thereabouts. So he had not had any instruction in almost 2 years. He informed me that he had not gone to formal school. He could read and write. I questioned him about the things that Ms. Wimbush would teach him, and he indicated language. He indicated that the children did something with beads, and I never figured out, I didn't understand. And he informed me that they did a lot of arts and crafts. Because I was, he told me, I believe, that both of you went to Georgia Tech, and so having gone to Georgia Tech, I assumed there was some sort of math in there. And so I followed up on whether he was being taught math and science, and he could not articulate that he was had received any instruction in math or science. So I believe he was not receiving any form of real education.
Okay. As far as Isaiah, you say you first met him June 26th?
Yes, sir.
Is that correct? Okay. And you say you heard about the scar through someone else. Who exactly was that?
It was the case manager for the Department of Family and Children's Services at the time.
Is that Angel?
No, I believe that it was Miss Boone or the notes from Catherine Embry. I don't recall which of those two that came from.
Okay. And did you follow up as far as after you talked to him, figure out what had happened or what became of that?
I did.
And what did you find out?
He was ultimately diagnosed with malignant cancer. He was placed on oral chemotherapy to try to reduce the size of the mass. And then subsequently, after a significant period of treatment, he had to have, I think, a fairly significant surgery to try to remove the cancer. But it was malignant.
And when y'all first prescribed the medication, when they first prescribed medication, did it work, or there's a backlash, or?
Initially, it did work. The mass began reducing in size. I think at some point the medication was no longer as effective, which is why they had to go the route of the surgery. But there were certainly some side effects associated with even oral chemotherapy that he went through. They were not reported to me to be significant, but there were side effects. I know that he was tired from the medication, and I know that he was worried about the surgery at some point while I was representing him. He had some anxiety regarding the surgery that he was facing.
Right, okay. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wimbush. Ms. Wimbush, any questions for Ms. Chansey?
Yeah.
Ms. Chancey, you stated that Ricardo indicated to you that they had done language of some sort, arts and crafts, they worked out of books, but couldn't communicate quite which books, is that correct?
Correct. He could not communicate with me any sort of curriculum, or oftentimes in homeschooling situations, there will be, the parents will subscribe to some sort of series of materials. He could not articulate that there was any series of materials that were being followed.
Okay. And you said that from your understanding, he had not received any math or science instruction?
Yes, ma'am. I followed up with questions regarding math. Given his age, I expected him to be doing some simple algebra. So I was like, so have you ever done any questions where you have to find out what X is? And he told me no. I asked him if he had to do worksheets where he had to multiply and divide. He told me no. That based on the questions I asked him, he could not articulate that he was receiving any instruction in math or science.
So then you weren't aware that Ricardo could solve systems of equations, Algebra 2 topic?
He did not articulate to me that he
Okay.
could do so.
Now, you stated that he could read and write and that he had done some language and arts and crafts. Did you ever make a statement to law enforcement or to the office of the district attorney that Ricardo, as well as all of his siblings, had never had any education?
Yes, he could never recall going to school, and he could not articulate any sort of program that was being followed, so I did make that statement.
That he had never received any education? Is that
did.
correct? Okay. And you based that on not having a series or something?
I based that on the fact that he could not articulate any course of education that he was receiving.
Okay. Did you also make a statement that Ricardo's parents said that he molested his siblings?
I did.
Is that a statement that you received directly from his parents?
You did not use the word molested. I believe that you specifically used the words inappropriate touching, but then you went on to describe it was touching of the vaginal and genital areas of children, which in my field is commonly referred to as child molestation.
Okay. You also stated that Ricardo and his siblings had never had any medical care. Is that correct? That you stated that to law enforcement and/or to the office of the district attorney?
Yes, I asked Ricardo specifically about his medical treatment. He could not recall ever having gone to a doctor. I asked him, what about your brothers and sisters? And he said that he did not know of them ever having gone to a doctor either.
Did you ask any of them if they had ever been to a hospital?
Are you referring to all 10 of your children?
Let's use just Ricardo for now.
Okay. I did not specifically ask him if he had been to the hospital. I asked him if he had seen a doctor, and he indicated he had not.
That he had not seen a doctor for himself, or just seen a doctor, what a doctor looks like?
He could not recall ever having seen a doctor in the context of a doctor checking him out, treating him for anything. He could not recall ever seeing a doctor.
Did he report to you that he was feeling ill?
No, he did not.
Did he report to you that he was sick and needed a doctor?
No, ma'am.
Okay. You stated that Ricardo told you that the lock had been, or that he associated the lock being placed on the door around August 22nd of 2012. Is that correct?
Yes, I asked him if he could recall something that happened around the time the lock was being placed on the door, and that's when he described to me running away. And he had associated the lock being placed on the door with that incidence of running away.
Did Ricardo ever tell you about visiting the Gwinnett County Jail as a result of the adjustment?
No, he did not.
He did not. Did he tell you about having to do, I guess, what they would call, in addition to visiting the jail, what they would call a Scared Straight program?
No, ma'am. He informed me he came to the courthouse and met with someone.
Okay. You said that Ricardo indicated to you that his mom would empty out the animal cracker jar? Is that correct?
Yes, he said that when you would come down, if he had needed to use I came later to find out it was an animal cracker jar from you, but he referred to it as like a plastic jug or a plastic jar. And he said that when you would come down, you would empty the jar if he had to use it, and it would be placed back in his room.
And you said that you were able to view the interview between Ricardo and Detective Churchill, and I know you said that it was some time ago, but do you recall that Ricardo in that video stated that his dad actually emptied that jar?
I do recall him saying that in the video.
You said when you met Ricardo, he appeared thin to you and that he might have appeared malnourished. Well, when you met Isaiah, did he appear the same way, thin and possibly malnourished?
He was very thin as well.
Yeah. Okay, now concerning Isaiah, you said that, and I'm not sure, you said that you felt the bump and it felt like fibrous strands. Can you explain that for me? Because do you have medical background?
I do not.
Okay, when you stated fibrous strands, what was your basis for that?
My actually feeling of it, an alternative way to describe it is it was like striated. Like if you separate your fingers and run your other hand over your fingers, there were like lumps and masses, and then there were like gullies where the tissue was soft.
Okay, so when you say fibrous strands, is that something that you're familiar with, fibroids or something like that you were given this as an example, as an association?
It's a term that I've come to,
Okay.
I don't know where it came up, but they felt fibrous. That it felt like there were individual fibers. For instance, if you like feel a tendon or something in your arm or your leg and you can feel it separate from the rest of the tissue, you could feel different lumps and masses, like almost like they were fibers. Or, for instance, women do breast exams looking for lumps and things like that. It was lumpy, and it felt strange, and it felt like there were separate fibers of different types of tissue under his skin.
Do you recall making a statement? Ms. Chancey, do you have former experience as an assistant district attorney in Gwinnett County?
I do.
Okay. Did you work with Mr. Mayfield?
He was never my direct supervisor, but we were in the same office.
Okay. In your statement did you ever make a statement to the Gwinnett County Police Detective Felicia Churchill?
No.
You never made a statement to her?
She and I spoke by email, I believe sometime around June 26th, but I've never been interviewed by her. We've never specifically discussed the facts of this case, if that's what you're asking.
Did you send her an email on June 19th of 2014?
I did not.
Okay.
I sent an email to employees of the district attorney's office.
Do you recall in that email stating that depending on how things go, there may be a very juicy transcript for y'all to read if you pursue an investigation?
I did. I had been informed, at that time you were represented by counsel, and your counsel had informed me that you and Mr. Wimbush intended to take the witness stand and testify.
Ms. Chancey, I'm going to ask that you not go into any privileged communication that may have occurred between Ms. Winbush and any attorney. Okay. So I'll ask the jury to disregard anything that you may have heard that may have been a communication between Ms. Winbush and any attorney that represented her.
So based on information that you obtained from those attorneys, not going into the information itself, you felt there may be a very juicy transcript?
I expected you and Mr. Wimbush to take the witness stand, and I expected you and Mr. Wimbush to testify, which you did. And yes, I expected there to be a lot of information to populate a transcript.
Do you have a copy of the email in front of you or beside you that you're referencing?
I have not been reviewing it, but it is here in the event I need to refresh my recollection.
Okay, I noticed that you looked down. You also stated in that email, and I know you have it next to you, in my opinion, these parents, or did you state in this email, in my opinion, these parents should be prosecuted criminally, and I'm a mandated reporter in this situation, so do with this email what you will.
Yes, I did state that.
You did state that. Okay, and all of this was before you obtained any statements from the parents via witness stand or anything like that, is that correct?
Yes, I drafted this email. The hearing on June the 19th didn't occur until very late in the evening, sometime after 5 p.m., and I drafted this email before we went into court. At the time that I drafted this email, I had interviewed Ricardo Wimbush Jr., I had spoken with Patricia Boone of the Department of Family and Children's Services, and I had pulled the juvenile court records that I previously testified to, and that is when the caption of my email is report of abuse, and I intended that report to be a report to law enforcement. The DA's office is the top law enforcement agency in this county.
Do you in any way have any bias towards the parents in this case, especially given the fact that you, in your opinion, that they should be criminally prosecuted?
No, ma'am.
You don't have any bias?
I certainly don't like what you did to your children, but I've conducted a fair investigation, and I've attempted in all regards to do what was in the best interest of your children this entire time.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd like to move to admit TD1, which is a copy of the email.
We'll need to mark it as TD2 because we have a previous document that was marked TD1. So if you'll show it to Mr. Mayfield, please.
Whoopsie.
Is that, and we'll let the deputy hand it to the court reporter so that she can mark it as TD2 for purposes of the record.
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, let me have that marked first. All right, if you can hand it back to Ms. Wimbush. All right, Ms. Wimbush, TD2 is being admitted without objection from the state, so it's admitted for the record.
You stated that as it pertains to Isaiah, that he had a surgery that you're familiar with, and you've been able to follow up with him, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And you stated that it was a malignant cancer, is that correct?
Yes, it was malignant.
Okay, and after the surgery, did it come back?
It did.
Okay, and did it get worse?
Not being a doctor, I don't know if it was worse, but he had large masses again on his abdomen.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Chance. It's been a pleasure.
All right, redirect. If you'll hand TD2 to the deputy, because it's been admitted for the record, we'll keep it up here with the court reporter, please. If you need it at any other time, that's where it will be. Mr. Mayfield, any redirect?
Very briefly, what does the term mandated reporter mean?
There is a law in the state of Georgia, and certain people, based on their status, are required or mandated by law to report abuse. Probably most commonly, school teachers. But In this case, I indicated to the DA's office that I was a mandated reporter and I had an obligation to report the abuse.
And what would happen if you came across abuse and failed to report it?
I could suffer actual criminal liability. in
Could
that.
you also lose your bar license?
Oh, absolutely.
Is that why you sent the email?
Absolutely.
Did you believe that you had grounds to send the email?
Yes. And I
Did you-
was obligated to do so.
Before you sent the email, was there any law enforcement involvement in this case at all?
Not to my knowledge. I did learn that an email had been sent that same day from DFAX to law enforcement, but to my knowledge, at the time that I sent this email, I was unaware of any law enforcement investigation of the case, and I certainly wanted the case to be investigated. I believe that it was in my client's best interest to have this issue followed up on as fully as possible.
Okay, thank you.
All right, based on the redirect examination, anything further from you, Mr. Wimbush? Ms. Wimbush, any further questions? No. All right, can Ms. Chancey be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, no objection to her being excused?
From my subpoena?
Okay, I'm asking, is she excused from further testimony in the case, yes or no?
No.
All right, you can remain on call, Ms. Chancey.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Mayfield, do you have a short witness that we can call at this time, or would this be a good time for the evening recess? All right, let me give Ms. Chancey a chance to exit. All right, members of the jury, at this time, we are going to recess for the evening. I'm going to remind you of your precautionary instructions, as I will do each night for any overnight recesses. Before you are released at this time, I wish to give you certain instructions regarding discussion